Hi, this is John Rood, CEO and founder of Perceptual.com. Today we're going to talk about New York City Local Law 144, oftentimes called the AEDT law, or sometimes the New York AI bias law. This presentation is going to be as short as I can possibly make it, and it's really targeted towards HR leaders. Today, we're going to talk about two things. First of all, what are the regulations that are coming to automated hiring tools? So we'll talk about the New York law in some amount of detail, but also at an extremely high level, what else should you be watching for? Secondly, we'll talk about how do you know if your organization has a compliance obligation or not. So as very brief background, in 2023, we're going to see a wave of new regulation that comes to automated or AI-driven hiring tools. That's sort of a term of art. I've spoken to a lot of HR leaders that if I say this law covers AI tools, they say we don't use those. But this law is actually really widely written, and we'll talk about how to know if the tools that you use are going to be covered. So first of all, New York City Local Law 144, we're going to talk about this in detail. The effective date is April 15th, 2023. So this is actual law. There's no possibility that's realistic that this won't actually become law in just a few months from today's date. Secondly, all of us are also watching really carefully the California draft regulations. This is a substantial change to California's privacy policy, and it'll really have a restrictive effect on employers and the employment relationship. So we're following that closely. And if you're a California employer, make sure that you have this on your radar as well. Third, and possibly most importantly, the federal EEOC has identified the issue of algorithmic hiring as one of its 3 priorities for regulation over the next 5 years. So as I'm sitting recording this video in February of 2023, we just a couple weeks ago spent an entire day listening through EEOC federal testimony on this issue. So the EEOC is taking public comment, and they are working through actively the regulation process. So there will be federal regulations on this in the next, if not in 2023, then certainly in 2024. So let's talk through New York City Local Law 144. So this law was passed a couple years ago, and it goes into effect on April 15th, 2023. They moved back this enforcement deadline a couple months. The penalty is actually fairly severe, so it's up to $3,000 per day per violation. And what that actually means in the law is the law stipulates that certain tools that we use as human resources professionals have to have an audit. We'll talk about that in a second. But for every tool that you use that should be audited according to the law that isn't audited, you have an additional violation. There's a separate penalty that's included in 3,000 here for certain notification requirements that you're required to give your candidates and employees. So this is something that's going to add up, right? There will be companies that are facing $15,000, $3,000, $4,500, $6,000 penalties literally every day. The law is really widely drawn, so it applies to companies that hire employees who physically reside in New York City. So this means that if you're based in New York, of course, but if you're not based in New York, but you are hiring in New York, which most companies that are large or medium-sized will have some employees in New York City, this law does apply to you. And the requirements, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a second, require that certain tools that we use as part of our HR toolbox that are called automated employment decision tools are going to require an audit. So we'll talk more about what that audit means. But the important thing that I want people to take away from the audit process language is the audit, by definition in the regulation, has to be an independent third-party audit, and those terms are defined in the regulation. So the audit for a certain tool cannot be done internally. So you as an HR leader, or even your compliance department or your general counsel can't do the audit internally. Furthermore, the vendor of the tool also can't do the audit. So if you use, Jazz HR for applicant tracking, you can't go to Jazz and say like, well, you guys do this and then just send me the results. That actually doesn't work. You as the employer specifically have to have an audit completed on your use of the tools. There's a wide range of systems that are going to be covered by the law, and these are the 4, really in order of what I've seen in terms of how many tools are going to need to be audited. So the first classification is applicant tracking systems. So I would say the primary reason that the law will come into effect and that the law will be needed done on your tools is if you're doing resume sorting. So typically you'll get, let's say, make the numbers easy, you get 100 applications for a given role, your ATS, whether it be Jazz or whatever, right, there's dozens of them, of course, is going to say, okay, hiring manager, we've sent you the 30 best resumes, right? So if the hiring manager is looking at the 30 and not reviewing the 100, the system itself, right, the automated system is making that decision about, what 30% to show and what 70% not to show. The second big chunk is going to be vendors of assessment. So there's specific language in the law calling out assessment vendors. So if you are giving potential employees an assessment that helps you understand a rank order of candidates, that likely has to be audited. So if you say, we gave someone an assessment and that they get a certain score, that means that probably does need to be audited. Now, if you are giving them an assessment that doesn't have a score and that doesn't allow you to rank order, it likely doesn't need to be audited. So if you gave your candidates like a simple Myers-Briggs test, to use an easy example, and then you're not saying like INTJs go to the bottom of the pile, that's what I am, then that tool probably does not have to be audited. Interview tools are also oftentimes going to be audited. So especially those that are doing some sort of algorithm on facial expressions, on word choice, et cetera, those have to be audited. And then some performance management tools may need to be audited as well. So the law does actually apply to internal candidates for jobs. So to the extent that you are, rank ordering your internal team for a promotion, those may need to be audited. Although this is much less likely than the other three applications seen here. So let's talk about that bias audit. A couple of things to know about it. First of all, the bias audit is annual. So we do it and it lasts for a year, then in a year we have to do it again. As I mentioned previously, the vendors can't do it themselves and also can't be done internally. And the bias audit is basically examining the outputs of each tool, comparing hire and no hire decisions across racial and gender groups. So there's a very specific set of charts that we have to produce. They're detailed out by the City of New York in these regulations. And so we say, again, using the example, we had 100 candidates and we put them through this screen and 80% of the candidates that came through the screen were men. That's going to be a big problem, right? So those are the things that, first of all, the government's looking for, that it's the whole point of the law, but that's basically what the audit is going to do. Once the audit is done, it does have to be posted publicly. So the way that we do it here at Perceptual is we'll do this audit work. We create a microsite with all of the charts that we need and all of the regulatory language that we have to have in there. And then we'll give you a link to put on your jobs or career site. But it is something that's going to be visible to the public. That's a really clear provision in the law. So it's not something that just gets to be done and then put in like a filing cabinet. It is going to be public. The other provision is the notification requirements. This is much easier than the audit requirement. It is something that can be done internally. So if an organization is using these tools, then there has to be a certain disclosure. First of all, that the automated tool is being used, what data is collected, and basically how it's retained. So this is going to feel a lot like a bunch of the other privacy laws that we have to comply with. So just certain language. If you work with us, we supply that language. We edit it so it makes sense in the context of your organization. Candidates also have to be informed that they can request alternative assessments or accommodations. In a really puzzling turn of phrase, it says this in the law, and then like literally 2 sentences later, it says that the employer doesn't actually have to provide an alternative selection process. So we hope that's something that gets clarified as this law keeps going into effect. Let's talk a little bit about what that audit process looks like. So assuming that your organization needs to complete the audit, we work through this 5-step process. So first of all, we're going to scope the way that you move your candidates through the process. Generally, when we talk to companies, some tools need to be audited and some tools don't need to be audited. So one of the things that we definitely do is in the final report that we present, we make public, we say, this particular tool doesn't need to be audited, and here's the reason why. Secondly, we'll give you a request for data collection. We need to get all of that candidate data. Oftentimes it gets just pulled out of an ATS and it's not a particularly complicated process. We do need to make sure that we're compliant with all your privacy requirements. That's really important to us for sure. Then we conduct the audit. So we produce a selection rate and an impact ratio. And those of us who have worked with EEOC and Title VII frequently throughout probably our entire careers may know what those means. But basically terms of art that need to be reported on. We will then show you, as the employer, the results of the audit. We talk it through. We always look at whatever the results of this audit are, we look at whether the data is statistically significant. And that's really important, particularly because For some tools, for smaller employers, or for certain parts of the population, the sample size of our applicant pool is likely to be quite small. So we make sure that we look at the significance of that data. Then we publish the audit, as I kind of alluded to previously. We put it on our own microsite, and then you'll link back. And then we give you those notification requirements. And once we've done those 5 steps, that's our check mark. That should be the check mark for New York. And the elapsed time of this process is usually about 2 to 4 weeks, although certainly the vast bulk of that time is our team working on this and not your team needing to be involved. So the short-term action items, first of all, understand whether or not your organization uses these tools. So if what we've talked about today, if that kind of raises your eyebrow, you say, oh yeah, we probably do some of that. Let's have a conversation. So we are happy to talk to you in detail, free of charge, about whether or not the tools that you use likely are going to be covered by the audit. And if they are, we want to get you in ahead of the April 15th deadline if possible, or if not, as soon after as possible. Then longer term, and thinking more about kind of the spirit of the law and the California law and the federal law that's going to come after it, training and education to make sure that these tools support our DEI and our culture goals, that's really important. And then making sure that we're starting to get out ahead of the California legislation and following the federal regulations really closely. If you sign up for our newsletter at our website, perceptual.com, it's linked there. We will send out all that information, right? So you sign up for our newsletter, we're going to get you up to speed on all the changes. What we do, just really quickly, first of all, we help you comply with this law that we just covered. Secondly, we do L&D. So we talk to HR departments, and we talk to leaders about why these regulations are coming into effect now, what are the issues, how does bias creep into hiring through automated tools, and then emerging compliance. So we're going to be a one-stop compliance shop as these new regulations roll out from California. There's a number I didn't talk about yet, or didn't talk about in this presentation, from Colorado, Connecticut, District of Columbia, New Jersey. So those are all somewhere in the process of becoming law. So we'll make sure to keep your department abreast of those as well. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it. Here's my contact information. Again, love to talk to you for free about which of these laws apply, and if they do, help companies get compliant as quickly and as cost effectively as possible.